In a town that punishes defiance with shame, a woman branded an outcast is saved by a silent Apache warrior. But their journey is not one of rescue. It is a wild, passionate discovery of two souls recognizing each other in a world determined to tear them apart. The sun is a merciless hammer, beating down on the cracked earth of Dust Devil Gulch. In the center of the town's only street, Serafina, 19, stumbles forward. Her spirit, usually as vibrant as the hidden auburn fire in her hair, is banked low, but its embers still glow with defiance. Her bare feet, soft and unused to such cruelty, leave small, bloody prints in the ochre dust. Across the thin fabric of her shift, painted in crude, viscous strokes of red clay, is a single damning word: disobedient. Her wrists are bound before her with rough twine, the skin already chafed to a weeping red. The townspeople watch from the cool shadows of their porches, their faces hard, unforgiving masks. These are the men whose clumsy advances she had deflected, the women whose pious gossip filled the church pews. They have judged her, condemned her, and now they watch her humiliation as if it were a Sunday sermon. They want her to break, to weep, to beg. She offers them only the grit in her jaw and the straight line of her back. Then, a sound. It slices through the oppressive humming silence. Not the tired clatter of a farm wagon, nor the familiar gait of a local's horse. It is the slow, deliberate, powerful beat of a single stallion. From the shimmering heat haze at the edge of town, a figure materializes, a lone Apache warrior, dark and solid against the bleached sky. His gaze sweeps past the gawking crowd, past the self-important sheriff. His eyes, ancient and dark as canyon shadows, find hers. And in their depths, she does not see pity or contempt. She sees a terrifying, exhilarating recognition. Part 1. The brand of shame. The heat was a physical presence, a weight on her shoulders that had nothing to do with shame. Serafina focused on it, on the sharp sting of stones against her soles, on the burning of the sun on her scalp. Anything to distract from the gallery of faces. There was Mrs. Gable, the preacher's wife, her lips pursed in righteous satisfaction. There was Blacksmith Tom, his powerful arms crossed, his face grim, refusing to meet her eyes. Children, their games silenced, pointed and whispered. Each face was a small death. Her crime had been a single word: no. The memory was seared into her mind, sharp and vivid. She was in her uncle's small, cluttered office, the air thick with the smell of cheap cigars and desperation. Across from her sat Jedediah Price, the banker's son Ashdod. He was a man built of soft living and hard cruelties, his eyes the color of stagnant water. He smiled, a greasy motion of his lips that didn't touch his eyes, as her uncle detailed the arrangement. Her hand in marriage for the forgiveness of a mountain of debt. "She'll make a fine wife," her uncle had said, not looking at her. "She's strong, obedient." The word hung in the air. Obedient. Serafina looked at Jedediah's hands, at the manicured nails, and remembered a different scene. A week prior, she'd seen him behind the stables, twisting the arm of a young stable boy, his face contorted with rage over a saddle that hadn't been polished to his liking. She'd seen the fear in the boy's eyes, a fear she refused to ever see reflected in her own mirror. "No," she had said. The word was quiet, but it detonated the room's fragile peace. Her uncle's face had turned a blotchy purple. Jedediah's smile vanished, replaced by a look of cold fury. "What did you say, girl?" I said. "No, I will not marry him." The progression of her fall was swift. Her uncle's pleading turned to threats. Jedediah's fury turned to a campaign of public ruin. The banker, a man who owned the town as surely as he owned the building with his name on it, began to squeeze. The preacher, beholden to the banker's generous donations, delivered a sermon on the wickedness of defiance and the sacred duty of women. Suddenly, Serafina was not just a girl who had refused a match. She was a disease, a rot that threatened the town's fragile moral order. The decision to parade her was Jedediah's idea, a piece of theater designed to break her and warn others. They had torn her from her room that morning. She hadn't screamed. She hadn't fought. She had wrapped herself in a cold, hard shell of silence. The red clay was mixed by Jedediah himself, its wet slap against her back a final, intimate violation. Now, as she walked, each step was an agony. She passed the saloon, the raucous laughter from within a counterpoint to her silent suffering. She passed the general store, where Mr. Henderson, a man who'd given her lemon drops as a child, now meticulously checked his inventory, his back turned to her. She passed the schoolhouse, a place of happy memories, now just another silent witness to her degradation. Her destination was the town square. In its center stood the whipping post, its wood scarred and darkened by sun and sorrow. It was a monument to the town's particular brand of justice. Two of the banker's hired men, their faces blank and brutish, grabbed her arms. The crowd pressed closer, a circle of vultures. They shoved her against the post. The rough wood scraped her cheek, a splinter catching in her hair. They cinched her already bound wrists to the weathered timber, pulling her arms up at an unnatural angle. The church bell began to toll, a slow, hollow gong for each year of her life. The sound vibrated through the wood, through her bones. The clay on her back began to dry, tightening on her skin, a cruel mockery of an embrace. Flies, drawn by the scent of sweat and blood, began to swarm her face. She closed her eyes, shutting out the hate-filled faces, and retreated to the only place she had left. The vast, empty plains of her imagination. It was there, in that inner silence, that she heard it. The hoofbeat. Slow, steady, inexorable. It was a sound that did not belong to this town. It was the rhythm of the wilderness, of ancient things. The crowd's murmur shifted from derision to confusion. Heads turned. The circle of hate parted. He rode a stallion as black as a moonless night, a beast that seemed carved from shadow and fury. The man on its back was Taza, mid-20s. He was not dressed for town. He wore simple buckskin trousers, a faded blue shirt that billowed slightly in the hot breeze, and moccasins that made no sound. His long jet-black hair was held back by a simple leather band, two braids falling over his shoulders, each intricately woven with red thread. A single hawk feather was tied at the back of his head. Around his neck hung a pendant of carved bone, white and stark against his sun-darkened skin. His face was all harsh angles and quiet strength, his expression unreadable, his eyes holding the stillness of a deep, dark forest. He rode as if the gawking townspeople were nothing more than sagebrush, his presence an indictment of their clamorous cruelty. He brought the stallion to a halt directly in front of Serafina, so close she could feel the heat radiating from the animal's powerful body. The horse tossed its head and snorted, a plume of dust settling on the shiny boots of Sheriff Miller, who took an involuntary step back. Taza's eyes met Serafina's. The world tilted on its axis. He didn't see the clay, the blood, the shame. His gaze was a physical force, stripping away the layers of her humiliation to find the core of her, the small, hard kernel of defiance that had started it all. He saw the girl who had said no, and in his eyes, she saw not a savior, but an equal. Part 2. A hand in the darkness. From Taza's perspective, the town was a festering wound on the land. He had been tracking a stream, heading for the high country, when the sound of the bell drew him closer. He'd seen scenes like this before in different places, with different faces. The righteous cruelty of men who feared what they could not control. He had seen it in his own past, a memory of his younger sister, shamed for speaking her mind to an elder. The memory was a cold stone in his gut. When he saw the girl tied to the post, it was not her shame that struck him. It was the way she held her head. She was a sapling in a storm, bent but not broken. He saw the fire in the rigid line of her jaw, the untamed wilderness in her wide, terrified eyes. He saw a spirit kin to his own, a wild thing caught in a clumsy trap. In that moment, the town, its people, its laws, ceased to exist for him. There was only the girl and the injustice. He dismounted in a single fluid movement, his moccasins making no sound on the dusty ground. The air was thick with the crowd's fear and hatred, a stench worse than week-old carrion. He ignored them. He walked toward Serafina, each step deliberate. He could feel her tremor as he approached, a frantic energy that called to something deep within him. He stopped before her, close enough to see the single tear that traced a clean path through the grime on her cheek. He reached out. His hand was calloused from the bow and the knife, but his touch was impossibly gentle. He laid his palm over her bound wrists, covering the raw, weeping flesh. Her gasp was a tiny, fragile sound in the charged silence. His touch was a shield, a promise. It was the first kind touch she had felt in what seemed like a lifetime, and nearly broke her. "That's enough," he said. The words were low, a rumble like distant thunder. It was not a plea or a challenge. It was the closing of a door. It was an end. Sheriff Miller, a man whose courage was measured by the weight of the coins in his pocket, finally found his voice, sputtering with indignation. "Now you hold on. This is town business. This woman is a transgressor, and she—" Taza cut him off, not with a word, but with a look of such profound and ancient contempt that the sheriff's words withered in his throat. Taza's attention returned to Serafina. He turned his focus to the twine, his fingers working with a practiced, nimble grace. He found the key knot and worked it loose. The bindings, which had felt like iron shackles, fell away, pooling in the dust like a shed skin. Serafina's hands were free, but they hung uselessly at her sides, shaking and numb. The blood rushed back into them in a wave of pins and needles. Taza didn't recoil from the sight of her raw wrists. He reached into the leather satchel tied to his saddle and pulled out a folded piece of soft cream-colored deerskin and a small pouch. He untied the pouch and shook a fine, dark powder of herbs into his palm, mixing it with a few drops of water from his canteen to form a paste. He took her left hand. She flinched, a lifetime of caution screaming at her. But his grip was firm, yet reassuring. With infinite care, he applied the cooling paste to her wounds. The sting was immediate, but it was a clean, healing pain. He then took the deerskin, tore it into 2 strips, and wrapped each of her wrists with a reverence that made her throat ache. He was not a doctor tending a patient. He was a priest tending a sacred relic. A wild, unfamiliar feeling surged through her, a current of heat that had nothing to do with the sun. It was a terrifying, exhilarating pull toward this absolute stranger. "You owe them nothing," Taza said, his voice a low vibration meant only for her. He had seen the truth in an instant. They had taken from her, and she owed them nothing but scorn. He held out his hand to her, palm up. An invitation. A choice. Every soul in Dust Devil Gulch watched, their mouths agape. They had written the end to this story. She was to be shamed, broken, and eventually married off to Jedediah as damaged goods. But this silent warrior had torn up their script. Serafina looked at his outstretched hand. It was strong, scarred, and steady. It was the first hand offered to her that did not want to take, only to give. She looked at his eyes, dark pools of quiet strength, and in them she saw not the end of a road, but the beginning of a trail. A trail leading away from this town, away from this life. She put her trembling hand in his. A collective gasp, like the wind rushing out of a cave, swept through the crowd. Taza's grip was warm and sure. He did not falter. He turned to his horse, leading her with him. With an effortless grace that belied his strength, he placed his hands on her waist and lifted her onto the stallion's back, settling her in front of the saddle. The horse shifted but stood steady, as if it understood the gravity of the moment. He swung up behind her in one fluid motion. His body was a solid wall of warmth at her back, shielding her. His arm came around her waist to hold the reins, caging her in a circle of safety she had never known. The scent of him, pine needles, leather, clean sweat, and something wild and elemental like the earth after a storm, filled her senses, overwhelming the stench of the town. He nudged the stallion's flanks with his heels. The great horse turned, its movement slow and deliberate, and began to walk away. They rode straight through the stunned crowd, which parted before them like the Red Sea. No one moved. No one spoke. They were paralyzed, not by fear of violence, but by the sheer, unassailable force of his dignity and her choice. Seraphina did not look back. The life behind her was a pyre of ashes. For the first time, she faced forward, toward the vast, unknown horizon, and felt not terror, but the breathless, heart-pounding thrill of being alive. Part 3. The Language of Silence. The town of Dust Devil Gulch shrank behind them, its ugliness swallowed by the vast, indifferent landscape. Seraphina sat stiffly, every muscle coiled. The rhythmic sway of the horse was a strange cradle, and the solid presence of the man behind her was both a comfort and a source of profound unease. A storm raged inside her, gratitude warring with fear, relief battling a wild, unfamiliar excitement. His arm, holding the reins, was a constant, warm pressure around her waist. She was acutely aware of his thigh pressed against hers, of the rhythm of his breathing near her ear. It was an intimacy so sudden, so total, that it left her breathless. He did not speak. For hours, the only sounds were the plodding of the horse's hooves, the creak of leather, and the whisper of the wind through the sagebrush. The silence was not empty. It was a space for her to gather the shattered pieces of herself. He did not ask her name. He did not ask what she had done. He did not ask where she came from. His silence was a gift, a deep pool of quiet, in which she could finally begin to heal. As the sun bled across the western sky, casting long purple shadows, a deep ache began to settle in her bones. She had been on her feet for hours, and the ordeal had drained her beyond measure. As if sensing her exhaustion, he steered the horse off the barely there trail and into a small, sheltered arroyo where ancient cottonwoods grew, their leaves rustling like 1,000 soft voices. He helped her dismount. As her feet touched the ground, her knees buckled. He caught her instantly, his hands firm on her arms, holding her steady. For a long moment, they stood there, his face close to hers. She could see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes, the fine lines etched at their corners by sun and wind. The air between them grew thick, charged with an unspoken current. It was a moment of pure, primal connection that transcended language. He released her slowly, as if reluctant to break the contact. While he tended to the horse, Seraphina knelt by the trickling stream that ran through the arroyo. The water was shockingly cold, a blessing on her hot skin. She drank deeply, then looked at her reflection. A stranger stared back, a wild-eyed girl with dirt-streaked cheeks and tangled hair. She cupped the water in her hands and scrubbed her face, then her arms. She hesitated, thinking of the cracked clay still clinging to her back. It felt like a brand, a permanent mark of her shame. As if reading her thoughts, Taza, who had been gathering firewood, turned his back to her without a word. He faced the trees, granting her a privacy more absolute than any locked door. The simple, unthinking gesture of respect struck her with the force of a physical blow. Tears she had refused to shed for her tormentors now welled in her eyes. She hastily unfastened her shift and washed the last of the humiliating red clay from her skin, the cool water a benediction. When she was done, she found he had built a small, efficient fire that gave off heat with very little smoke. He sat cross-legged beside it, the flames painting his high cheekbones in flickering gold. He was slicing thin strips from a piece of dried meat with a sharp obsidian knife. He looked up as she approached, his eyes tracking her movement. He simply nodded toward a spot on the other side of the fire and held out a piece of the jerky. She took it, her fingers brushing his. The brief contact sent a jolt through her arm. She sat, pulling her knees to her chest, and ate. The meat was tough, salty, and smoky, and it was the most delicious thing she had ever tasted. They ate in silence, the fire crackling between them. Later, as the stars began to appear, a brilliant cold canopy in the black sky, she noticed the bone necklace lying on a rock beside him. During the ride, she had clutched it so tightly that its intricate carvings were imprinted on her palm. He had taken it from her when they stopped. Now, he picked it up. He didn't put it back on. Instead, he leaned across the fire and held it out to her. She stared, confused. I can't," she stammered, the first words she had spoken to him. He did not retract his hand. He simply waited, his patience as vast and silent as the night. She understood. It wasn't a gift to be earned or paid for. It was something being entrusted to her. Hesitantly, she reached out and took it. The bone was smooth and surprisingly heavy. She looped the leather cord over her head. The pendant settled in the hollow of her throat, its coolness a strange comfort against her skin. That night, he laid out the single bedroll for her, close to the fire's warmth. He himself took a spot several feet away near the edge of the clearing, his back against a cottonwood tree. He was a silent sentinel, his form a dark shape against the deeper darkness of the night. Sleep was a long time coming. She was hyper-aware of his presence, of every shift of his weight, of the soft sound of his breathing. This man had saved her life, had treated her with a tenderness she had never known, and he was a complete mystery. The wildness she had sensed in him was not one of violence, but of a profound, untamed freedom. And it called to the caged part of her own soul. Just as she was drifting off, a question burned its way out of her. "Why?" she whispered, her voice barely a breath of sound. "Why did you stop?" For a long moment, there was only the sound of the fire. She thought he was asleep or ignoring her. Then, in the darkness, he moved. He reached into a small pouch at his belt and drew out a single perfect eagle feather, its edge tipped with white. He held it up so it caught the faint light of the dying embers. He didn't speak. He touched his own heart with the tip of the feather, then extended his hand, pointing the feather toward her heart. The meaning was as clear as any words. "I saw myself in you. I saw the same spirit." A wave of emotion, so powerful, it stole her breath, washed over her. It was not just gratitude. It was a profound, earth-shattering sense of being truly seen for the first time in her life. The wall she had built around her heart cracked. Before sleep finally claimed her, she whispered a single word into the sacred space between them. "Thank you." She wasn't sure if he heard it. But in the morning, when she awoke, the feather was gone, and the necklace was still resting securely at her throat. Part 4. Echoes of the Gulch. They traveled for 2 more days, moving ever deeper into a land that grew wilder and more beautiful with every mile. The harsh, scrubby plains gave way to rolling hills dotted with pinyon pine and juniper. The silence between them evolved. It was no longer the silence of strangers, but the comfortable, easy silence of companions. It was a language all its own. A raised eyebrow from him was a question. A slight nod from her was an answer. He taught her, through gesture and example, the subtle arts of survival. He showed her how to read the tracks of deer and coyote in the dust, how to find water by watching the flight of birds, how to identify the edible roots of the yucca plant. She was a quick study, her senses, long dulled by town life, sharpening to a razor's edge. He watched her with quiet approval. A faint, almost imperceptible smile sometimes touching his lips. One afternoon, a sudden, violent thunderstorm rolled in from the mountains. The sky turned a bruised purple-gray, and the wind whipped through the canyons. Without a word, he guided the horse into a shallow cave carved into the side of a sandstone cliff. Inside, they were sheltered from the driving rain and the crack of lightning that split the sky. They sat together in the cool twilight of the cave, watching the storm rage. The air grew cold. Seraphina shivered. Taza removed the heavy wool blanket from his bedroll and, without hesitation, wrapped it around her shoulders. He then sat beside her, so close their shoulders touched, sharing his own body heat. Under the blanket, in the close confines of the cave, the air crackled with a different kind of electricity. Seraphina could feel the hard muscle of his arm against hers, could smell the rain in his hair. She turned her head to look at him, and found him already watching her, his gaze intense and searching. The hunger she saw there was not for food or warmth. It was a mirror of the wild, aching need that was growing in her own heart. The storm outside was nothing compared to the one brewing between them. The moment stretched, taut and fragile, until a particularly loud clap of thunder made her jump, breaking the spell. But the promise of that moment lingered long after the rain stopped. On the third morning, they reached their destination, a hidden canyon, a slash of impossible green in the red rock landscape. A waterfall tumbled down a sheer cliff face into a turquoise pool, its mist watering a lush grove of cottonwoods and willows. The place felt ancient, holy. As she knelt by the pool to wash her face, Taza suddenly went still. His entire body became a single, tense line of awareness, his head cocked, his gaze fixed on the high ridge that formed the canyon's rim. Seraphina's heart leaped into her throat. She followed his gaze. 3 figures on horseback were silhouetted against the bright morning sky. Her blood turned to ice. Even from this distance, she knew. The arrogant slump of the leader's shoulders, the glint of sun on a long rifle. It was Jedediah Price, with 2 of his hired thugs. The tendrils of Dust Devil Gulch had reached even here. Panic, cold and suffocating, seized her. She felt like a trapped animal. But Taza was beside her in an instant. He took her hand, his grip a band of steel around her trembling fingers. "Trust me," he whispered, his voice low and urgent. He acted with breathtaking speed. He pulled her behind a dense curtain of weeping willows that grew by the water's edge. With a fallen branch, he swept the ground, erasing their tracks, every sign of their presence. He scattered the cold ashes of their small morning fire, kicking dirt over the spot until it was indistinguishable from the surrounding earth. He was a predator hiding his trail, melting them back into the landscape. The riders' voices, ugly and sharp, drifted down into the canyon. "She's got to be down here," Jedediah shouted. "There's water. A savage wouldn't pass up a place like this." Another voice laughed. "He won't give her up easy. You saw the way he looked at her." Rage, pure and cleansing, burned away Seraphina's fear. A prize to be given up. Was that all she would ever be? She clenched her fists, her nails biting into her palms. Taza placed a hand on her shoulder, a silent command to wait. Then he did the last thing she expected. He stepped out from behind the willows, into the open, positioning himself between her and the trail leading down. He stood alone, unarmed, his hands loose at his sides, a figure of infuriating calm. "She is not yours," he called up to the ridge, his voice clear and steady, echoing slightly against the canyon walls. Jedediah spurred his horse down the narrow trail, his cronies following. He pulled up 20 feet from Taza, his face a mask of smug hatred. "She was never yours either, Apache," he spat. "We have a contract, a legal, binding contract. You stole property from my town." "She is not property," Taza said, his voice dangerously quiet. "I'm not going back," Seraphina cried, stepping out from the willows to stand beside Taza. The sight of her, defiant and alive, seemed to enrage Jedediah further. "You ungrateful little witch," he snarled. He raised his rifle, leveling it at Taza's chest. "I'll kill him, and then I'll drag you back by your hair. You'll learn what it means to obey." He never fired. A sharp, piercing cry, like that of a red-tailed hawk, split the air. It was answered from the opposite ridge, then from the rocks above. And then they appeared. From the trees, from the shadows, from the very earth itself, Apache warriors materialized. A dozen, then 20, maybe more. They were silent, deadly apparitions on painted horses, armed with bows and lances. They formed a semicircle, trapping the 3 townsmen in a ring of silent, implacable judgment. Jedediah's face went slack with terror. His cronies looked wildly about, their bravado evaporating like mist. Lead rider, a woman with a stark, beautiful face marked by a thin white scar that ran from her temple to her jaw, dismounted. She moved with the grace of a panther. She walked past the terrified men as if they were stones and stopped before Seraphina. She looked at Seraphina, at the necklace at her throat, and then at Taza. Her gaze was sharp, assessing. Then she gave a single, curt nod. Acceptance. She turned her burning gaze on Jedediah. "You bring the stink of your town here," she said, her English halting but clear. "This is not your place. She belongs to us," Jedediah stammered. The woman's lip curled in a sneer. "Nothing belongs to a man with a small heart." She uttered a sharp command in her own tongue. Instantly, 2 warriors were on Jedediah, disarming him with practiced ease, holding his arms behind his back. Jedediah stared at Seraphina, his face a pathetic mixture of fury and disbelief. "You're choosing them? Savages? Over your own kind?" Seraphina stepped forward, her head held high. She took Taza's hand, lacing her fingers through his, a public declaration. "He is more my kind," she said, her voice ringing with the clarity of absolute truth, "than you ever were." The woman warrior gave another command. The riders who held Jedediah and his men released them with a shove. "Go," the woman said. "Do not return." The 3 men scrambled for their horses, broken and humiliated, and fled the canyon without a backward glance. As the sound of their hoofbeats faded, an unearthly quiet descended. The world seemed to shrink until it contained only the 2 of them. The tension that had been simmering for days, the unspoken desire that had crackled in the air, finally ignited. Taza turned to her, his eyes blazing. He cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs tracing the line of her jaw. And then, his mouth was on hers. It was not a gentle kiss. It was a raw, desperate claiming. It was the storm in the cave, the fire in the night, the terror of the confrontation, all unleashed. It was a kiss of ferocious relief and furious possession, a branding of his soul onto hers. She met his hunger with her own, her hands tangling in his hair, pulling him closer. It was a kiss that sealed their past and claimed their future, a wild and passionate fire in the heart of the canyon. Part 5. The Naming of Fire. In the aftermath of the kiss, a new kind of silence settled between them, a silence no longer shaped by caution, but by a profound and smoldering intimacy. The presence of his tribe, who had melted back into the landscape as quietly as they had appeared, had been a clear statement. She was under their protection. She belonged. The days that followed were a testament to that belonging. They began to build a life in the canyon, a life woven from shared work and quiet passion. Taza, with the help of a few others from his band, constructed a small wickiup, a sturdy shelter of willow branches and hides, near the base of the waterfall. Seraphina worked alongside them, her hands, once soft, growing calloused and capable. She learned to mix mud and grass to seal the walls, to strip sinew for cordage, to smoke fish over a low fire. She learned more of his people, not through words but through observation. She saw the deep respect they held for the elders, the gentle way they treated their children, the reverence with which they took from the land, never more than they needed. The woman warrior, whose name was Lawson, became a quiet mentor. She taught Seraphina which plants healed and which could harm, her lessons conveyed through gesture and example. She would hand Seraphina a root, crush it to show its color, and point to a bruise. Language was a barrier, but understanding was not. Seraphina in turn showed Luzon how to stitch a wound with a fine needle and thread from her small sewing kit, a skill the Apache woman, used to cruder methods, watched with fascinated respect. She was no longer an outsider. The children would bring her things, a shiny pebble, a bird's feather, a strange wildflower, and say her name, or their closest approximation of it. But she had no name, not really. Seraphina was the name of the girl from Dust Devil Gulch, a ghost she was leaving further and further behind. One evening, as the moon rose, a perfect silver disk over the canyon rim, Taza sat by the fire, carving a piece of cottonwood bark. He had been working on it for days. Seraphina sat opposite him, mending a tear in his shirt, her movements slow and content. The domesticity of the scene was something she had never imagined for herself, yet it felt more right, more true, than anything she had ever known. Their nights were a silent conversation of touch and breath, a deep and passionate exploration that left them both shaken and whole. He had mapped the landscape of her body with a reverence that healed the scars left by the town's hatred. He finished his carving. He held it in his palm for a moment, then leaned across the fire and offered it to her. She put down her sewing and took it. The wood was warm from his hand. It was a small, stylized figure of a woman. Her hair was long and wild, and in her outstretched hand, she held a tiny, intricately carved flame. It was so simple, yet it captured an essence she was only just beginning to recognize in herself. "It's beautiful," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. He leaned closer, the firelight dancing in his dark eyes. He placed his hand gently over her heart. "Kiona," he said, the name a low murmur, a secret. "It means fire that waits, the fire that smolders under the ashes, waiting for the wind to give it life." Her breath hitched. A name. A name that was not a label, but a definition. A name that spoke not of her shame, but of her resilience. It felt like a key turning in a lock deep inside her. "Kiona," she repeated, tasting the syllables. The name settled over her like a warm blanket, a second skin. It was hers. She looked from the carving to his face, her heart overflowing. This man had not just saved her body, he was saving her soul, piece by piece. "And you?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "I don't know your name." A slow smile spread across his face, a rare and devastating sight that made her heart ache. It was a smile of pure, unadulterated joy. "That is for you to give," he said softly. "The one who sees the spirit must give the name. You will name me, when you are ready." The weight of his trust was immense, a gift more precious than any jewel. He was giving her a power over him, an intimacy that went beyond the physical. He was making her the keeper of his identity. She looked at him, the silent warrior who had ridden out of the sun and changed her world, and knew that finding a name worthy of him would be the most important task of her life. Part 6, where the rain meets the flame. The seasons turned. Summer's fierce heat softened into the golden melancholy of autumn. The cottonwoods in the canyon turned a brilliant yellow, their leaves blanketing the ground in a carpet of gold. Winter brought a hushed quiet, a soft layer of snow that transformed the red rock landscape into a world of stark and beautiful contrasts. Through it all, the bond between Kiona and Taza deepened, settling from a fiery passion into a love as steady and enduring as the canyon walls. Their life was a rhythm of shared tasks and comfortable silence. He would hunt, his movements as fluid and silent as the shadows, and she would prepare the meat, tend their small garden of squash and beans, and learn the intricate patterns of her new people. She became known for her steady hands and her quick mind. The children loved her, drawn to the quiet warmth that had replaced the fear in her eyes. She watched Taza constantly, studying him, learning him. She learned the meaning of every subtle shift in his expression, of the tension in his shoulders, of the way his eyes would soften when he watched the eagles soar above the canyon. She saw his strength, not just in his skill as a hunter and warrior, but in his infinite patience, in his gentle handling of a wounded animal, in the way he would sit for hours with a grieving elder, offering his silent presence as a comfort. She searched for his name in the world around her. She considered Hawk for his sharp eyes, or Stone for his unshakable strength. But they felt incomplete. They described what he did, not who he was. Spring returned, and with it, the rains. One evening, a soft, steady rain began to fall, drumming a gentle rhythm on the hide roof of their wickiup. They sat inside by the fire, the air warm and close. Kiona was weaving a basket from willow shoots, her fingers moving with a skill that would have astonished the girl she once was. Taza was polishing the bone pendant he had once given her, which she had returned to him as a sign that she no longer needed its protection. She had found her own. She paused in her weaving, looking at him across the flickering firelight. The answer had been there all along, so simple and so obvious. She thought of the day they met, of the cracked, parched earth of dust-devilled Gulch, of her own soul, which had been a barren wasteland of shame and despair. "I am ready," she said softly. He looked up, his hands stilling. His dark eyes questioned her. "I have a name for you," she said, her heart pounding with the rightness of it. She put down her basket and moved to sit before him. She took his hands in hers. They were strong and calloused, the hands that had untied her bonds and healed her wounds. "They named me Kiona, Fire that waits, she began, her voice steady. Because even when they tried to smother me in ashes, a spark remained. He nodded, his gaze full of a fierce pride that made her spirit soar. But you, she continued, her voice dropping to a near whisper. You are the rain. A soft sound, a breath of understanding, escaped his lips. Because you came when my world was fire and dust, she said, her vision blurring with tears. You did not come like a flood, to wash me away. You came like a gentle, steady rain on dry ground. You were quiet. You were patient. You soaked into the earth of my soul and brought me back to life. He did not speak. He raised her hands to his lips and kissed her calloused knuckles. Then he leaned forward and rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed. He breathed in, a long, slow breath, as if he were breathing in her words, her love, her very essence. Rain, he murmured. The name a perfect fitting sound on his lips. He said it again. Rain, testing it, tasting it, accepting it. It was not just a name, it was their story. He opened his eyes, and in their dark depths she saw her past, her present, and all of their tomorrows. He was the rain, and she was the fire. Separate, they could be destructive. But together, they created life. He pulled her into his arms, and their love, which had been forged in defiance and tempered by passion, settled into a peace as profound and life-giving as the rain on the thirsty earth. Above the door to their home, he later carved 2 symbols, a flame and 3 wavy lines beneath it. Fire and rain. A testament not to a rescue, but to a recognition, a story that would become a quiet legend, whispered by those who understood that the wildest hearts often find their homes in the most silent of places. VO, in the vast, unforgiving theater of the Wild West, the grandest stories were not always written with bullets and blood. True strength was not the roar of a lawman, but the quiet courage of a single no-do. True power was not in the hand that held a weapon, but in the one that gently healed a wound. The story of Kiona and Rain reminds us that home is not a place you are born into, but a sanctuary you build, piece by piece, with another's soul. It's a testament that some fires are not meant to be extinguished, and some spirits are never truly meant to be tamed. Their love story, as passionate and elemental as the land that cradled it, is a vital part of our Wild West history. It wasn't a story of a man saving a woman. It was the far more profound story of 2 people recognizing the shattered pieces of themselves in each other and realizing that together they were finally beautifully whole. These are the Wild West talbes that reveal the true heart of the frontier. Thank you for joining us at Wild West Stories. If their story moved you, please show your support. Like this video, share it with those who appreciate true Wild West stories, and subscribe for more tales from the untamed heart of American Wild West history. We are dedicated to keeping these Wild West stories alive.